time that we have spent together these Tuesday evenings, and for some time together as one to look a little more deeply into Scripture, especially the prophets, and get a better sense of their work and your work in them and in your people, your Hebrew people. So tonight, God, help us as we finish up, and may the message that was there thousands of years ago, may it become clearer to us tonight as we reflect and look deeply. This we pray in Christ's name. Amen. Okay, so real quickly, so last week, just want to tell you what, for those of you, if you weren't here, what we covered, which was Elijah and Elisha. And then after, even though they're not technically writing prophets, there are no books with their names on them, then we got into what is called the latter prophets, or the writing prophets. And we started with Amos, and we went through Hosea, and then Micah. And is that it? Yes. Yes. So one more little person that we consider, or actually, no, I'm confusing. No, the last little tiny prophet before we get to the three of the big guys is Jonah. Now, everybody in here probably knows a little bit about Jonah, right? So what do we know about Jonah? What's the big story behind Jonah?
Jonah and the whale.
Jonah and the whale. Like Sunday school kids, that's one of the books we talk about, right? So the thing that's different about the book of Jonah is that, unlike all the other prophets that focus on their message, what did they say? What was the word God gave them to tell the world? Think about the story of Jonah. That's not what happens in the book of Jonah, is it? It's all about what happened to the prophet. And what did happen to the prophet? What didn't he do?
He didn't do what he was asked to do.
Yeah, he didn't give the message of the Lord, right? So he was told to go to Nineveh. By the way, so what's the significance of the city of Nineveh? Yeah, it was the headquarters city of the Syrians. Okay, headquarters. And so, and we don't have clear dating on this, but probably earlier on. And God says to Jonah, "Go to the Ninevites and preach to them my word." And he says, "No, they're evil people, not happening." And so he heads west, gets on a ship in the city of Joppa, and he's going to Tarshish. Why? Because he's running away from what God said. And then a storm comes. You know the story. A storm comes, and he tells the sailors, "Just throw me over." Again, you do the math. The math is there's a storm, God's ticked. So it's all about me, throw me over. And they say, no, we can't, because they somehow know he's a prophet. And by the way, Jonah is mentioned in 2 Kings, I think. Yeah, Jonah is actually mentioned in the book of 2 Kings. Anyway, so they throw him over, and then what happens? He's swallowed by a fish or a whale or something like that. And he spends 3 days in the whale. And then the whale throws him up on dry land. God says, what? Second chance. We're going to try this again, right? And so go to Nineveh, like I told you. And does he? He does. And what does he do? He preaches the word, and the word was either straighten up, as my mom used to say, or 40 days and it's over for you. And guess what?
They listened.
They listened. They listened. And they did. And so we would say, wow, that was really great. Effective, right? No. What happened? What did Jonah do next? How did he solve it? He went to the edge of the city while they're all repenting. And remember, these are not Hebrew people. These are a foreign nation. He goes to the edge of the city, and he makes himself a little encampment, a little tent or something, and God causes, well, probably, if the story is true, a castor bean tree that grows very quickly, and he sits in this little tent thing, and he sulks. And the tree grows, and God, it was like a gift of God. I'm providing you shade, right? You're in the desert. And then what happens to the little tree? It dies. And then what happens to Jonah? He becomes very sad. And then at the very end of the book, God says to Jonah, what? You are so upset over this stupid tree, but you weren't upset that hundreds, whatever it was, 10,000 people in this city were, worshiping idols and lost. But yet so the message is what? It's actually bigger than we think. Number one, the God of Israel is sending a prophet to heathen nations. Which again, that changes their concept of God, right? God's bigger than your tribal God. God may just be concerned about a wider group of people more than the Hebrew people, more than your tribe. That's a huge theological issue, right? And then there was a couple of other things, and also the idea that God is kind. And Jonah says, I knew you were a God of loving kindness. I knew this was going to happen.
Oh, God.
It's really quite a story. And of course the question is it historical? Is it meant to be literal? Is it figurative? The interesting thing is who references Jonah in the New Testament? Who references the story of Jonah? Jesus himself. When someone, I think there were Pharisees who came to him asking for a sign. Do a magic trick for us. And Jesus says to them, the only sign you're going to see is the sign of Jonah. The 3 days in the way, the 3 days in the resurrection. So Jesus references this story. You still can't absolutely make the case that it was meant to be absolutely literally true. Like most stories, there's usually some, even in the lies we tell, there's some truth in them somewhere, So I'm not one of those who said it's impossible, I don't believe it. Why not? And for a long time they said, well, nobody can survive in a whale, but then scientists prove that, yeah, there are whales that can swallow human beings, and yes, you could probably survive 3 days. Who knows? It's still a wonderful story. Theologically speaking, it's really incredible. Okay, so there's little old Jonah. Any thoughts or questions about that? All right, now I want to spend some time especially on the book of Isaiah. It is the first of what we call the major prophets. Why are the major prophets major? Simply the size of the book. That's all we mean by major. The size of the book is the largest. And I think Isaiah is the largest book in the Old Testament. Major prophet. He was a prophet of the southern kingdom. By the way, it changes a little bit, so again, you can see the southern kingdom lasted a couple hundred years longer than the northern kingdom. So Isaiah was in the southern kingdom. Here's the thing about the book of Isaiah, and I don't want to make this too complicated. For years, you say the book of Isaiah, and you would say, well, that's one guy, right? The book of Isaiah. It's all Isaiah stuff. But when the scholars get into it, it appeared clear early on. There's 66 chapters. But the first 39 chapters are markedly different from the other, whatever it's left, 26 chapters. So for a long time, everybody got comfortable saying, well, the first part of Isaiah was one Isaiah, the second part was what they call Deutero-Isaiah, or the second Isaiah. A little while later, someone said, well, actually, when you really start looking at the prophecies in there, the last 11 chapters are even different than theirs, so they started saying, well, there's probably 3 different Isaiahs. Bottom line is, no one knows for sure, but here's the reason why they say that. So the first 39 chapters of this huge book are prophecies that sound like an Isaiah prophet in the southern kingdom having witnessed this happening up north, the fall, the invasion and the fall of our brothers and sisters in the northern kingdom. It sounds like a prophet in the southern kingdom saying, we better get our act together because That's what happened to them. It's going to happen to us, right? That's the first 39 chapters. Prophesying. The city, you're worshiping idols again. You're unfaithful to the law. There is social injustice going on. We've gotten fat and rich on the backs of poor people, etc., etc., etc. That's what it looks like. The next chunk, chapters 40 through 55, the way the oracles are laid out, it's as if it's someone who has been carted off to where? Babylon. Early on. Writing from Babylon, and in those chapters, he's giving hope. God will send a remnant back. Some of us are going to get back. We're going to get back. Okay. And then those last 11 chapters sound like a prophet who got back, who was part of the remnant that came back after the exile, because the exile was only like 55 years or 50 years, something like that. They were only 50 years before King Cyrus. That's another whole story. Some of them go back. And by the way, not all of them wanted to come back. Only about 50,000. You know why? Because they liked Assyria, or they liked Babylon. They liked it. It was good. That's where one of the Babylonian Talmuds came from. So there's a whole bunch of Jews, and they're so, you know what? This is home now. This is home. But 50,000 did come back. So that's very simplistic, but that's the backstory to why almost every reputable scholar says there were at least 2 Isaiahs, because the time period is so huge. It's so huge. It spans a couple hundred years. Okay, so probably it was at least 2, if not 3. All writing from the perspectives of being in the country before it falls, being out of the country when it did fall, and then being back in the country when the remnant came back. Is that clear as mud? Okay. All right. Now here's some really cool stuff. Isaiah is a very oft-quoted book in the other parts of the Scripture, especially the New Testament. Especially later, after the Christian canon comes together, people started to view Isaiah's oracles as the prefiguring of Christianity. Witness Handel's Messiah. Okay. I love Handel's Messiah. Everybody love Handel's Messiah. You know it's an oratorio and the first part of it is about the coming of Jesus the Messiah, right? So I got my glasses. So I found a booklet to my copy of Messiah. So you're going to hear all these verses that we hear during Advent, and then we're going to go through them, and you're going to see that lo and behold, Handel, like many people of that age, before archaeology and everything else, they were all thinking this was all a prefiguring of Jesus. Okay, but Handel knew his Bible, but he borrowed, in most people's opinion, a little too liberally. So the beginning of the first recitative, Isaiah, Roman numerals. You just had to use Roman numerals. X and L. What's L? 15?
40.
40. Thank you. Okay.
Well, I mean, I know.
Whatever it is, you'll know this. Comfort ye, my people, saith your God. Speak comfortably to Jerusalem, hello, second kingdom, and cry unto her that her warfare is accomplished, that her iniquity is pardoned. That's coming, sounds like, by the Isaiah that was in Babylon. We've suffered enough. We're going to get out of here. Okay? The next one follows verse 4. Every valley shall be exalted, every mountain and hill made low, the crooked straight, the rough places plain. Then the wonderful chorus, and then the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all shall see it together. Then Handel goes to the prophet Haggai, which we'll talk about in a second. Thus saith the Lord of hosts, yet once a little while, and I will shake the heavens and the earth, the sea and the dry land, and I will shake all the nations, and the desire of the nations shall come. And then to the prophet Malachi. Then he jumps to Malachi. The Lord whom ye seek shall suddenly come to his temple, in the messenger of the covenant whom ye delight in. thing is, when you go back to these verses and start looking at them in context, has little to nothing to do with the coming of Jesus, including the one about and a virgin shall conceive. First of all, the word is mistranslated. It is not virgin. It is, clergy brethren, young woman. It does not say virgin. Bad translation. It doesn't say it.
Or they wanted it to be virgin.
Yeah, it says it's young woman. But anyway, the cool thing is that all of this is, almost all of it is quotes. Most of it is from Isaiah, a little bit from Malachi, one from Haggai, and then we get over there, one from Zechariah, two from Zechariah, more from Isaiah. But so the point is that Handel did what everybody was doing. He was thinking that Isaiah was all about the prophecy of the coming of Christianity. All right, so let's talk just a little bit more about that. Handel's Messiah, probably more than anybody. Go ahead.
Many years ago when I was teaching a class on Handel's Messiah, and a man came up to me, and I was speechless.
He walked his...
I'm so glad that the words of Handel's Messiah got into the Bible. And I didn't know
What do you say? You can't
Don't say anything.
Steve Gorman speechless?
Thank you, Cindy.
No.
So let's talk just real quickly about that verse about and a young woman shall conceive and bear a son. So when the first Isaiah was prophesying, it was during a time of a terrible, terrible king. And they were all hoping that the king would have a good son. And the prophecy was really about hoping that the king would bear a good son through one of his wives. That's really what it's about. Sorry to burst anybody's bubbles. Okay? You can still love Handel's Messiah, but that's really what the verse is about.
Wow.
Well, there are those that would claim that he was actually there at the birth of this, and I forget which king it was.
I think it was Jehoiakim or something.
Jehoiakim.
Yeah.
Oh, no, any first child, son, this kid's going to be wonderful.
Yeah.
The
And
next Solomon.
Yeah, they were basically counting on the next king, the son of this bad king, is going to be, and that's who this shall come to the temple, and it's going to be better. This is going to get better. We're going to have a good, righteous king. Okay. What else I mean, there's so much here, guys. At the tail end of the book, it starts when they're back. They're looking forward to this reunification of all the kingdoms, the northern and the southern kingdom. That it's all going to come together under like a new king, okay, a new king, like King David and Solomon. Because remember, they've been 400 or so years without at the end of Solomon, okay. And they're all hoping that we're going to get our acts together and we'll become a monarchy again. We're going to be a great kingdom of the world again. And they're looking forward to that. And again, Christians have extrapolated from that and said, well, that's more a prophecy of Jesus as king. And if you look at some of those verses, they also mention sacrifices in the temple and all that sort of stuff. And they say, so how do you square that? Hoping for a kingdom where there's a new king and there's a temple where the sacrifices are happening properly. How do you square that up with Jesus and no more sacrifice? And it just doesn't square, because that's not what it was meant to be. That's not what it was. It really wasn't. That doesn't mean we can't love it. It's beautiful poetry. It's beautiful, beautiful writing. And it's probably the most quoted book and why everybody loves it. Okay? So, okay, it's already 23 after. Any questions or comments about that? That is super brief. Yes?
When I look at those numbers, those years, 586 years before Christ, and I think about how much for granted I take the printed word, and the fact that that was so rare, that how did these people of faith with scrolls that were handwritten and read aloud and memorized and shared. There was no internet, there were no libraries, and it just always amazes me that God made it possible for a people to carry their story for
That's why they were so
centuries.
precious, those scrolls.
Yeah, and the Word of God was so precious to them. And we take it so lightly.
Does anybody know, I think I heard the other day, I was watching a YouTube video that said that in the Dead Sea Scrolls, that the biggest majority of the scrolls were scrolls of Isaiah. Is that true, Bob? I think that's what I heard. That book was so important to them, to the Essenes anyway, that the vast majority of the scrolls were from the book of Isaiah. Not the entire thing, but so many of them were. Isn't
And
that
my
incredible?
understanding is that most of the Isaiah that was found was Deuteronomy,
The second.
second or third Isaiah.
Yeah.
Was the big
Yeah.
chunk that was found.
Yeah.
That whole idea puts me to shame. Have I ever read Isaiah from beginning to end? No.
Yeah. You know what? One thing I decided I'm going to do though, I did read through the prophets 4 or 5 years ago, but having done this, I'm going to start again. I'm going to start with Isaiah. And Jeremiah and Ezekiel are interesting too. We're going to talk about them next. But to just go back and read through with just that little bit of knowledge that we gained this way, and I think it'll be more meaningful to understand the context. Because some of it's just so bizarre, we don't know what they're talking about, right? It is. All right. Let's talk about the next big major prophet, which is Jeremiah. Jeremiah is called the what kind of prophet? The weeping prophet, yeah. Sad pictures of doom. So he also was a Southern Kingdom prophet. Southern Kingdom. Probably around 630, something like that. Maybe a little bit later. I'm trying to see what are some of the important things I want to talk about. Jeremiah was a prophet when Nebuchadnezzar, he was around when Nebuchadnezzar first started to come in and start to take over parts of the southern kingdom. King Nebuchadnezzar the Babylonian. Jeremiah, they let him stay. They didn't kill him for some reason. They didn't kill him. But some of his friends carted him to Egypt, was it? If I remember the story? Yeah. So he was alive when it was taken over, and they let him, they didn't kill him, but his friends kidnapped him and took him to Egypt to hide him away in Egypt. So Jeremiah comes all the way down to 586. 586, so he's a little bit later. Okay. Some of the things that you might have heard about him, and before that happened though, he kept prophesying the destruction of the nation and the temple. Why? Idolatry, prosperity built on the backs of the poor, blasphemy. They were basically turning away from the faith of Moses. Okay, and he kept saying, you keep going in this direction, it's going to happen. What happened up north a couple hundred years ago, we're next, and it happened just the way he said. So he was also not liked. He was not liked at all. He was thrown into a well for a while. He was beaten up in the public square and put in stocks by one of the priests, by one of the temple priests. He may have been the chief priest, but he was out in front of the temple, it's all going to come tumbling down. Jesus said the same thing. And the chief priest had him put in stocks. He was thrown into a well, but he was not liked. Jeremiah was like a thorn or a burr under the saddle to a lot of the religious and governmental established people, because he just kept saying, you're all sinners, it's going to come crashing down, you're going to make us pay. The other thing that's very interesting, Jeremiah, he has a lot of arguments with God in in his books, in his visions, where he very honestly confronts God and says, I don't understand, I don't understand why you don't go ahead and punish these people. They're lousy, rotten sinners. Why don't you just, if you're a God of justice and righteousness, why don't you do this? So there's a lot of very honest, like, hair pulls with God in there. And then he would succumb to God, and he would say, okay, basically, your will be done, not mine. The prophet of doom, and yet he would say, because God is sovereign, and because of the covenant, made with Moses, and because of those covenants, we are going to be punished. The temple is going to be destroyed. We are going to fall. But God is faithful. God will restore the nation. So it's like we're going to have it rough for a long time. But God does not give up on us, even though we have given up on God. Does that make sense? So he was both the prophet of doom and the prophet of hope. Okay, always hoping for that future. Okay, that's Jeremiah. And we also read that the book of Lamentations was also, we also think that was probably written by, or the sayings of Jeremiah the prophet.
Jim, there is in Coptic Cairo an ancient synagogue that is kind of dedicated to his presence there.
In Egypt.
Yeah.
Because of his sojourn in Egypt.
Because they believe he was there.
Yeah.
And a common name for a lot of Christian men is Aramea, which is Jeremiah.
Cool.
Aramea.
So, truth to this stuff.
They believe he was there, and it's a real ancient, simple synagogue.
Wow. And that's in Cairo? Wow. Okay. All right, let's move to Ezekiel, who is the third major prophet. There's three major prophets, three big books. So Ezekiel's number 3. Ezekiel, scholars believe, actually did his ministry while in exile. He was one of these in exile in Babylon. So his oracles, his stuff, is being prophesied to the exiles in Babylon. He was from a priestly family, we believe. It's in the book there. It was a priestly family. He was 25 years old when God called him. So he came as a young man, called into prophecy. He was one of those who lived comfortably in Babylon. He had his own home there, and that people would go to him for like counsel and advice. So he was very comfortable in Babylon. But Ezekiel was very strange. And have you ever read the book, The Visions? They are very, very strange. He was at least a mystic. He saw the mystical element of the universe. Some people think that he was psychotic or potentially schizophrenic because the visions are so bizarre. They're so bizarre. Either that or he was truly a mystical visionary person. So he prophesied to those, and he kept saying, the remnant will go home. There will be a remnant who will go back and reestablish God's kingdom, or the kingdom of Israel in Jerusalem, with Jerusalem as head, and the temple will be rebuilt. It will be rebuilt. Here's something else I learned, that unlike the Assyrians, they were very cruel. They were very cruel. And one of the reasons scholars say the tribes were, you've heard of the 10 lost tribes of Israel? There were 12, right? The 10 is because the Assyrians made sure to divide up tribes and families. They were cruel, horrible people. And so the slaves were separated by families, or from their families, from their people, to get them to intermarry and to get them to lose their memory of home. The Babylonians were not as cruel, and they allowed the Jews to live in different communities. They established their own little towns and communities. They let them build their homes, and they let them establish businesses. So the Babylonians were not as cruel, and that's why the vast majority of them didn't want to make the trip back home. Everybody thinks, oh, they all picked up and went. That's not true. They think maybe 50,000 came back. Of, I don't know, a couple 100,000? I don't know. But only 50,000 came back. All right. What else here? Here's something I learned about Ezekiel. Ezekiel was very passionate, but he also, the Jewish people feel that he didn't interpret the law. He was a little too loosey-goosey with Moses' law. So I didn't know this. Arvid, Bob, Steve, Sin, maybe you guys knew this. Did you know that the prophet Ezekiel is not allowed to be read in the synagogues because of that? It is considered a canonical book in the Jewish religious library, but it's not to be read in the synagogue on Sabbath day. And get this, you're not allowed to read it unless you're at least 30 years old, because it's so bizarre. And because they feel that Ezekiel misinterpreted or didn't properly preach Moses' law. That was new to me. I did not know that. But yeah, you can't read the book of Ezekiel in the synagogue. Yeah, they don't read it. It's not in their, it's like our lectionary readings. They don't allow it. And I got that from a Fuller professor, by the way, so I trust him.
Who was that?
David Allen Hubbard.
Well, there you go.
There you go. All right, so yeah, but it's still a part of the canon, of the Jewish canon. But because of those misinterpretations of Moses, they don't allow. You can't read it because why? You're saying the wrong thing. But yet he was a prophet. Okay, I thought that was pretty cool. He also did bizarre things. He acted out his prophecies. So, for example, he laid on his side for 390 days, and that was to act out one of his prophecies. That's something about 390 days or something. And so he laid on one side for 390 days, and then another 40 days on the other side. He was acting out. He also shaved his head with a sword, which was probably a really bad mess. He also practically starved himself to death, but he's acting out one of his oracles. So he not only prophesied it, he found a way to dramatize it, visualize it. Yeah, and there's more than that. Was he the one with the yoke one? That's not him. Jeremiah.
But he did see a wheel.
Yeah, I was gonna say, the thing most of us remember is the opening chapter and the wheel in the middle of the wheel. That's the opening chapter. There's actually 4 wheels, and they're all spinning independently, and it's supposed to be sort of a symbolic image of the Spirit of God. It's very bizarre. It's very, very bizarre. And then you heard me preach last Sunday on the dry bones. That's from Ezekiel. Again, the dry bones in the desert of Babylonia. They're going to come together. They're all going to come back together and live. That's what that's about. It's prophesying. It's all going to come back together and Jerusalem will be reestablished. Is that helpful? Same thing in Ezekiel, chapters 40 through 48. A lot of Christians look at that and see what's being described there, which is a messianic kingdom. The problem is, again, Ezekiel says the same thing. He's talking about the temple being reestablished and the idea of sacrifices in the temple. And so the critic, and by the way, this comes from, I found this cool book in the Lakewood Library. It's actually a book on the prophets, not by a Christian, but by a Jew, seeing it from a Jewish perspective, which was incredibly helpful. But even the evangelical Christians say that's very problematic to Christianize something that's talking about a temple with animal sacrifices in it. It's just, you just can't square it. So that's...
Well, there are Jews today in Jerusalem who have all the plans for how to rebuild the temple. They're going to make it happen.
Well, that's the hope.
Yeah.
Here's an interesting factoid for you for Ezekiel. Guess what crazy book in the New Testament quotes it the most? The book of Revelation. There are 48 quotes in the book of Revelation from the prophet Ezekiel. I didn't realize that. 48. Because Ezekiel is so apocalyptic, which is what Revelation is, John the Revelator, who wrote the book of Revelation, borrows heavily from the prophet Ezekiel. Thought that was interesting. All right, those are the three major prophets. Didn't say a lot of major stuff there, did I? All right, so now we're going to zoom. Fasten your seatbelts. Okay, so now we're going to finish up with what we call the minor prophets, only because some of them are one chapter, and some are 6 or 7. So let's talk about Zephaniah. Zephaniah. A lot of these are Southern Kingdom people, or prophets. So Zephaniah, Southern Kingdom. There was 50 years where there were no prophets. 50 years of prophetic silence about midway in your paper on the kings under this King Manasseh. Apparently there was 50 years where there was no prophetic voice, and Zephaniah pops up and starts preaching against the usual stuff: idolatry, violence, social injustice, privileged people getting richer and richer on the backs of poor people, etc., etc. Same message. Look what happened up north. The same thing's going to happen to us down here. We saw Israel, the northern kingdom, collapse. Going to happen to us if we don't turn ourselves around. But he said the same thing as other prophets. However, God made a covenant with us way back here. And even though we are unfaithful, God is faithful. So we may come to pieces and get punished for all this stuff. But in the end, because God is faithful and God is faithful to the covenants, we will go back. We will reestablish the city, even though we will be exiled or whatever. A faithful remnant will return, and God's covenant will continue on. Does that make sense? So it's doom, but it's in the end hope. Doom and hope. Covenant. That's Zephaniah. I think you should name your children some of these cool names. Okay. Next one is the prophet Joel, which we do here in church. We do here in church. Joel chapter 2. This is the one, I think, Pentecost Sunday. Joel.
Acts 2.
Joel 2. Yeah, it's quoted in Acts. Or I'm thinking Malachi. I'm sorry, Malachi. This is Ash Wednesday.
Ash Wednesday.
Yeah, Ash Wednesday. Yet even now, you turn to me with all your heart, with fasting, with weeping, with mourning. Rend your hearts, not your clothing. In other words, you need some heart religion, not some head religion or outward religion. Because God is gracious and merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love. We hear that a lot in church during the time of confession, right? And then here's the Ash Wednesday verse that we hear. Blow the trumpet in Zion, sanctify a fast, call a solemn assembly, gather the people, sanctify the congregation, the children, even infants. Let the bridegroom leave his room, let the bridegroom her canopy between the vestibule and the altar, let the priests, the ministers of the Lord weep. Those are Ash Wednesday verses. Okay?
But doesn't Peter also use Joel in his declaration on Pentecost Sunday?
I think so. Or is it? Are we confusing Malachi?
I don't think so. I think it's Acts.
Hang on.
Yeah.
Yes. Here it is. Then afterward, I will pour out my spirit on all flesh. Your sons and your daughters will prophesy. Yeah,
That's from
there's
Joel.
there's the Pentecost Sunday. Your sons and your daughters will prophesy. So again, that's the hopeful part. There's the doom. This is the hopeful part. But God will come back to us, and we will prophesy. The Spirit. He's saying the Spirit not only in me, because the prophets were said to have the Spirit, right?
Pour it on your
In that
sons
last
and your
day,
daughters.
all of you will have the Spirit that I have. Okay.
Yeah.
All right, that's the little prophet Joel, all 3 chapters there, okay? Oh, yeah, Acts chapter 2, Peter quotes Joel, when, that first day when all those people are, all right. Yeah, okay. Next little prophet is Nahum, also a southern kingdom prophet. I think most of these are southern kingdom prophets. He does the same thing, the prophecy of the destruction of Jerusalem and the southern kingdom, the destruction of Nineveh. Nahum predicts the destruction of Nineveh. Why? Because Nineveh is Assyria. He's prophesying God's retribution upon the Assyrians who destroyed the northern kingdom. Sorry, I misled you. That's what Nahum does. And Nahum, as far as I know, I was saying to Bob, I don't think Nahum is even in our lectionary. Does anybody know? I don't think there's a passage, because it is grim, and it calls for bloodshed and destroy the enemies, and I don't think it's even in our lectionary. You'll never, unless it's just selected, it doesn't come up in our lectionary. Did you know that? Because it's all about God's wrath on the Assyrians and the city of Nineveh. So it's weird, because Jonah was called to go and preach to them years earlier, and they repented, right? But yet, they ended up attacking the northern kingdom and taking them captive. So Nahum's all about, all right, God's going to destroy this city now. Go ahead, Steve.
The preacher last night at Presbyterian who took those verses in the 139th Psalm that we skip also, about it's okay to hate.
Vengeance.
We don't like the passage about it's okay to hate. I mean, this begs the question, wouldn't it be interesting to preach a series of sermons on the verses you won't find in the lectionary?
Wouldn't it be?
It's all yours, Steve, go for it.
A couple of years ago, I started out a sermon where I selected one of those real bloody things from the, about, someone cuts your arm off, you get to cut, it was a really, people were just like twisting and turning. So then we got to the New Testament where Jesus says, forgive your enemies, love your enemies, and forgive those. But it was funny for people to hear what's actually in the Bible.
Sure.
I love to do this with fundamentalists, because most of them don't really read their Bibles, even though they say they do. And they don't, when they hear this stuff, it's very, I used to love to do that to my poor fundy mother. That Bible doesn't say that. I go, yes, it does. It's right in there. Anyway, so that's the book of Nahum.
She's such a nice son.
I know. 3 chapters, jealous, avenging God. A jealous, avenging God. And I put here, doesn't square with Jesus' teachings. All right. That's Nahum. Okay, scooting right along. Here comes Habakkuk. Again, a southern kingdom prophet. He again predicted the invasion of Babylon to destroy the temple and take the city over. Here's something that it just occurred to me, Captain Obvious. You guys probably know this. So Habakkuk has this thing called his watchtower. Remember that? It's sort of like his place where he goes to pray and reflect and ask God to show him what he needs to see. Did you know that the Jehovah's Witnesses get...
That's
Where have
what
I
they
been all this
get.
year? I didn't know that. The Jehovah's
your
Witnesses,
magazine.
that's their magazine.
Yeah.
They get that from the Habakkuk. I didn't know that. Okay.
Have you seen a watchtower?
Yes, I have.
They're in the corners of grape arbor,
Oh, real one you mean?
real ones,
Like a
yeah.
deer.
Yeah. They're like in the corners of the fields of the grape.
Okay. No, I
You gotta
didn't
keep
know.
track.
Well, he loved his, so. He probably, the same thing, he was prophesying against oppression, cruelty, social injustice, and idolatry. Same thing they're all talking about. I said, for some reason, read chapter 1, verse 4. If I can find it here real quick.
Habakkuk also raised questions similar to the book of Job, and the question of how a righteous God can
Yes.
allow suffering.
Yeah, why is there suffering in the world? Do you really love us, God? Why, yeah, theodicy. Okay, listen. Oh Lord, how long shall I cry for help and you will not listen? Or cry to you violence and you do not save us. In other words, God, what are you doing up there? Why do you allow this evil to continue? Which are the questions that Job asked. Why do you make me see wrongdoing and look at trouble? It's all around me. In other words, he's saying, God, get out of your rocking chair and do something. Okay?
Don't you feel like that after you hear about Nashville?
Yes.
I mean, these are very contemporary feelings.
Yeah.
Things haven't changed.
Yeah.
But in the end, God's answer to Habakkuk is basically, well, just sit tight because the Babylonians are going to do my work of vengeance for me. That's who's going. You will see my wrath and vengeance through those people. That was the answer he got. Here's another thing. Paul borrowed words from Habakkuk and built some of his theology around it. The just shall live by faith, right? Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 4. But Habakkuk is talking about those who go into this exile, if they just do the right thing, worship God, live by faith, the faith of Moses, then you'll be preserved. You'll make it. And some will come back and get this all corrected and started again. Paul references it, talking about his, when he was preaching about justification, living by faith, justification by faith, he reaches back in his Sunday school memory and remembers this verse from Habakkuk. And of course, Luther and the others use the same thing. So that comes out of Galatians chapter 3, where he references. It'd be interesting, wouldn't it, to go through the entire New Testament and find where Jesus or Paul and the apostles referenced the prophets. Jesus did do that. He quoted it a lot. So have you heard that verse, the just shall live by faith? That's right. All right, Daniel. And remember what we said the first time together? The Jews do not consider Daniel a prophet. Daniel is in the prophet section of our Bible. In the Jewish Hebrew Bible, he is not considered a prophet. Okay. The Jews understand the book of Daniel to be like the book of Revelation. It's apocalyptic literature. Okay. And the story is about Daniel and his three friends who are carted off early to Babylon. Okay? They go off early. King Nebuchadnezzar says, find me 4 young guys. I want them wise because then I'm going to bring them over and I'm going to train them to be a part of my Babylonian kingdom. Daniel's one of them. And it turns out Daniel has really good paranormal gifts of dream interpretation and that sort of thing. And he interprets the dreams of King Nebuchadnezzar. But it gets on. And fundamentalist Christians love the book of Daniel. Love it. They love it as much as they love the book of Revelation. And he sees all kinds of kingdoms, but it's meant to be apocalyptic literature. The idea that in the end, God is sovereign, God will prevail. And some of the things mentioned were about kingdoms, but they were back then. He wasn't talking about Russia or China, which is what you'll hear on the radio. He was talking about Babylonia and Assyria and those kingdoms. But it's a fascinating book. It's a fascinating book. You know, the writing on the wall, the finger that wrote on the wall, that's from the book of Daniel. Okay? All right. And it says, my book said that Daniel lived to the day that King Cyrus, the king of Persia, who invaded Babylon, took over Babylon, and the Jews left and said, you guys can go back home if you want. You don't have to stay here. Daniel lived to see that day. So he was late, probably late, very late in the process. Okay. And Daniel predicted Nebuchadnezzar's downfall. Right? All right. Obadiah. Can anybody quote something from Obadiah?
Obadiah.
It's a great name. Yeah, it's a great name. It's the shortest book in the Hebrew Bible. Did you know that? Shortest book. One little, 21 verses. Hardly even a chapter, right? Again, Southern Kingdom prophet. Those 20 verses are all a vision of this tribe called the Edomites, who we believe lived down south, like around the Dead Sea. They were a little wandering problem to the Southern Kingdom, and he envisioned their downfall, God's destruction of the Edomites. 21 verses, that's all it is.
Oh, thank you.
That's all it is. That's all I have for that. All right. Next one is Haggai. Southern Kingdom. Yeah, no, that was Hosea. Yeah. So Haggai was at a time when they were settled in Babylon, when the exiles were there, building their homes and their doing businesses and actually getting along quite well. And he prophesied down there. Jeremiah told them all to get comfortable and relax. You're going to be there a while. Because one of the prophets, who Jeremiah said was a false prophet, said, you're only going to be here 2 or 3 years. And Jeremiah said, no, you're not. You're going to be here like 50 years. Well, it turns out Jeremiah was right. 50,000 did come back. And Haggai is all about coming back and getting settled and doing the right thing and being righteous. Okay? And that's the prophet Haggai. He and the prophet Zechariah came back. They oversaw the rebuilding of the temple, because remember, the temple was destroyed, right? The Babylonians destroyed the temple in the city. So they come back, and the first thing they want to do is get this temple rebuilt. And that actually, I learned, was actually the second temple. Herod actually just remodeled it, I guess. But that was the second temple. And Zechariah and Haggai were the prophets that came back to the southern kingdom, into Judah, into Jerusalem, and oversaw that. There are 4 main prophecies in this little book. The first one is all about, you got to finish the temple, just get it done. The second one was the idea that the Shekinah, what they call the Shekinah glory of God, which is what we would call the whole special presence of the Holy Spirit, that they believed left when the temple was destroyed, the Shekinah glory was destroyed or left, that the Shekinah glory would come back into the temple if you just get the darn thing rebuilt. That was prophecy number 2. And then the third was where he was talking about sanctifying your hearts. He said it's not enough just to build a nice temple and put nice furnishings in it and do all those right things. He said you've got to work on the temple on the inside of your heart, which is what Jesus talked about, right? Jesus was like, in my mind, a lot like that. It's not, you need some interior religion to go with your exterior stuff. So that was the third one. And then the fourth, again, the idea that not only will we come back and rebuild the temple and have our city, eventually God's kingdom will be here again. We'll all be united, both kingdoms, and we'll be the seat of the universe, and we'll have one kingdom, and we'll have a new monarch, the whole thing. Okay. So along with Zechariah. Now, just a few words about Zechariah, who helped him do this. Zechariah had these things called night visions, which are what? Dreams. Special dreams, right? Special dreams. Zechariah's stuff is a lot like apocalyptic literature. So he saw horsemen, a lot of 4s in there. 4 horsemen and 4 this and 4 that and 4 the other thing. And then the branch of David. And remember that branch Davidians? Were they the ones that died in Waco?
Yep.
They got their name from this book, from Zechariah, the branch Davidians. It's from one of Zechariah's prophecies about the branch. Bizarre, huh? But it is very apocalyptic, like the book of Daniel and like the book of Revelation. The other cool thing in there, or interesting thing I should say, is that you start to see images of God's adversary. And they think this could have come about because of the Zoroastrians. Because the Zoroastrians, the Zoroastrian religion said that there's the good God and the bad God, and they're equal. Whereas we say there's one true God, and Satan or evil is simply God's enemy, but nowhere near equal to God, right? But the Zoroastrians said, no, there's the good God, then there's the demigod.
And they're more
And there's
ancient
a battle.
than anything.
The Zoroastrians is probably the most ancient religion on earth. But some of that creeps in here, and he starts talking about this adversary, almost like the beginnings of a Satan. You're starting to see some of that in Zechariah, which I thought was pretty interesting. Okay. Finally, 3 minutes ago, the book of Malachi, the last little book in the Hebrew Bible. Here's something that is interesting that I got from the Jewish scholar and others. The Jewish people believed that when Malachi died, that was the last of the prophets, and again the Shekinah glory of God, the Holy Spirit departed. Now, fast forward, 400 years to the day of Pentecost. The idea that the Spirit returned, where? Not to the temple,
To a house full of disciples.
in human hearts. And the idea in Joel, in the latter days, the Spirit will come back, I'll pour out my Spirit on all people. I think that's pretty cool. The Jews believed that the Holy Spirit departed, the Spirit of prophecy departed with the death of Malachi. They call it the Shekinah glory. The Spirit, the Shekinah glory that was centered in the temple and the Holy of Holies. I thought that was interesting. Malachi again said the same thing. Don't mix marriages, no idolatry, don't oppress the poor, don't discriminate, don't build your riches upon the backs of poor people and slaves, etc., etc. At the same time, there was growing criticism about organized religion. The priests were living very, very well. It sounds like the Reformation, doesn't it? So there's a lot of criticism of organized religion, but the religion, of course, is the temple in Jerusalem. And they're saying the priests are sinners. They don't practice what they preach. They live well while the rest of us are hungry half the time. So there's a lot of critique of organized religion at that time. And Malachi is addressing this and saying, yeah, the temple is corrupt. The people are corrupt. And back to Handel's Messiah, that wonderful bass recitative, and suddenly the Lord will do his temple, the whole idea that someday it's going to come back, it will come back. And Elijah, he starts referencing the coming of Elijah. Remember, Elijah was the weirdest of all the prophets who could do like magical things and not only prophesy, but do these great signs and wonders. Malachi is sort of predicting an Elijah figure will come back. And if you get into the New Testament, they start comparing Elijah with whom? John the Baptist. John the Baptist. He was send my messenger in the latter days. Isn't that interesting? All right, that's prophets. All right, so that's a lot of stuff. So what do we make of it for our day and time? The message of the prophets for us. They're still a part of our Holy Scripture, right? They're a part of our sacred library. Bizarre as some of it is. But what's the main message? There's one God. Do not have idols. Whether your idol is a golden calf or money or affluence or fame or power, whatever you worship and serve the Lord only. There's one God and you only serve that God, right? And then the idea of social justice. You've got to be fair. You've got to be honest. You can't oppress and abuse people to make your life better. What are some of the other things? What's that, Catherine?
Love your neighbor as yourself.
Some of them said that, yeah. Some of them said that.
Change your mind.
Yeah.
Your mind and
Like-
your body work together.
Yeah, like Jonah. That God is a God of loving kindness and that God cares about the rest of the world. And if you're called to go preach that good news of Him, then you've got to go do it. But there is that not so good shadow side of the prophets who were very human, right? And who wanted God to avenge and wanted their enemies to be avenged and to suffer. There's that part of it. But it's all there. It's all there. The important thing, I think, is that you have to read it in its context. Don't pull stuff like that has been done. Don't pull stuff out of context. And extrapolate inappropriately. And build theory and theology like some of the crazy cults have done with some of this stuff. But read it in its context. What was actually going on when the prophet said that? Does it really mean, is it really predicting an event in our day? Or was it talking about something back then? Just be honest. What's really going on there? But their message is still very, very relevant for us. Very, very relevant for us. And that's why we still read them and preach for them, and that's why they are in our sacred library, and why the Christians didn't decide to just throw it all away. Does that make sense? Anybody want to add anything else before we call it a night? Well, I'll just say this. Thank you all for coming. I hope that if we've done not much more, I hope this has helped you to understand the Hebrew Bible, to understand just a little bit more of the history, a very high level overview of the history, so that when you hear these names, I hope you could place things just a tiny little bit better than you did beforehand. Understand, there were only 3 kings. It was only 100 years. Of all that 1,400 years of history, it was only 100 years. The rest of it was judges or these crazy kings who didn't do what they were supposed to do. The next part of it, there's a real interesting, this whole period called the intertestamental period that comes, that's really fascinating. But I just took you up to this point. But I hope that it helps you to understand or feel a little more comfortable with the Old Testament than when we first started. Yes, Dennis?
Okay, question here. Two questions. First question is, Jesus quoted a sign of Jonah before they were asking him to give them a sign. So he said, the only sign I'll give to you is the sign of Jonah. So
What was the sign? I'm sorry?
What is he trying to tell them?
The sign of Jonah, because Jonah was in the belly of the whale for 3 days. The sign that the people were going to get, that they were asking for, he says the only sign you're going to get is the same sign of Jonah. You're going to see a person in the belly of a whale or a tomb for 3 days. That's the sign you're going to get. In other words, be careful what you ask for. They wanted him to do like a miracle or magic. Yeah.
And then he came out just like Jonah came
And he
out.
came out just like Jonah. Yeah. I mean, it wasn't like Jonah in that.
Not
I mean,
Jonah, yeah.
again, Jonah disobeyed and wouldn't do it. But the sign of Jonah is that he survived 3 days.
Yeah.
And Jesus was saying to them, you're going to see the same thing.
But Jesus really died.
Yeah.
Jonah didn't die.
Right. So that's the sign of Jonah that you hear about. It's pretty interesting. Jesus knew his Bible for a lot of it. He knew his Bible.
Yeah.
Do you know what book he quoted from the most? I didn't know. It's either Isaiah or Leviticus. Believe it or not.
Well, you threw a lot of the laws back into the
Yeah, he was often critiquing laws, yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, he was upholding Isaiah and
Interesting. All right, I'll let you go, but thank you guys, I really do appreciate your
Thank
being here.
you.
All right, blessings.